In the last unit, we created a game in which we were moving a helicopter across the sky while avoiding the clouds. Let's consider some possible extensions or additions that can make this game even more interesting and challenging. What could we add? One option would be to count the number of times our helicopter touches the clouds. To do this, we need a place to store this value, what we call in computer science a variable. A variable is a space in the computer's memory where we can hold information used by our program. Variables have a name and a value associated with them, which we can access to use or modify. For instance, here we've defined a variable called name, which has value Dave, as well as an age variable, which has value 14. You can think of variables as label drawers which contain a piece of information. The labels help us identify the variable that we're interested in, and we can then access it to read its value or even modify it. Just like drawers can be for personal only or for common use, we can distinguish between local and global variables. Local variables are for the personal use of a specific program element, such as a sprite, and cannot be accessed by other sprites. On the other hand, global variables can be used by all program elements. Variables are a fundamental concept in computer science, and they're very useful when developing games. For instance, to keep track of the score, the difficulty level, or the number of lives of our characters. To extend our helicopter game, we'll create a variable in Scratch. We'll go to the Data palette and click on Make a Variable. This will create a place to store the number of times the helicopter hits the clouds. We'll give it a representative name, such as times or hits. I'll go for hits. We'll set this variable to be global, so we'll choose for all sprites. This gives us more flexibility for the future, so if later on we decide to add more sprites, they can also access and modify this variable. When the program starts its execution, the number of hits should be 0. We can define this by using the block setHits20 and introducing it right after clicking the green flag. When should this hits value change? Every time the helicopter touches a cloud, its value should increase by 1. We can do this with the use of the block Change Hits by 1, which we'll place right after the saying block. Now, let's run the program to see how the number of hits changes with each collision. We need to make sure that the hits variable is selected in order to make it visible on the stage. Brilliant! We can now keep track of the number of hits. We could further extend our game to incorporate some graphic effect during a collision. For example, we can use the block Change Brightness Effect by 25, placing it before the Say block, and we can restore the helicopter's looks by introducing a Clear Graphic Effects block later on. We can further enrich our helicopter game to include instructions to the user. This way, the user will know straight away what he's expected to do. These instructions to the user are the equivalent of the so-called user documentation that you would see in professional software systems. User documentation typically includes tutorials and manuals which guide the user. In our case, we don't need a manual. Including instructions is enough. We can do this by having the helicopter say these instructions for a few seconds at the very beginning of the game. For instance, it could first say, "Move me with the arrow keys." And then, "But avoid the clouds." Let's try it out. Good. Now, how about including a restart button, which lets us start the game afresh? The idea is that the restart button would reset the number of hits to 0. How can we do this in Scratch? We'll introduce a button sprite from the Scratch library. This is rather big, so we'll go to the Paint editor to modify it and click on Convert to Bitmap. Before resizing it, we'll add some text so that the user knows what it's meant to do. We can use the text tool to type restart, and it will make the text white. We'll also make sure that the text is placed in the center of the button. Good. We'll now shrink our button. We can also specify where to place the button when the game starts. For instance, I'll put it next to my hits counter. Now we'll specify that when we click the button, the number of hits is set to 0. So we'll introduce a When this sprite clicked block from the Events palette, followed by a block to Set hits to 0. Let's test our revised helicopter game to see if it works. Now I'll hit the restart button. Excellent! The number of hits was reset to 0. We invite you to try more effects and incorporate more ideas to enrich this game.